Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the third day of the Jewish Museum's Transatlantic Kafka program. I think we have a really amazing program tonight, so I'm happy to share this with you. My name is Seth Rogoff. I'm one of the co-organizers of the program for the Jewish Museum and the chair of the Journalism and Media Studies program at Anglo-American University. As I've done in the two previous evenings, I like to start the program with a short reading of words by Kafka in honor of Kafka and his work. On this evening, I'd like to turn it over to Ross Benjamin to read from his relatively newly released translation of Kafka's complete diaries. So I'm going to turn it over to Ross, and then I'll do proper introductions after the short reading.
October 1st, 1911. Altneu synagogue yesterday. Kol nidre, muffled stock exchange murmur. In the anteroom, a box with the inscription, "Secret donations appease indignation." Church-like interior. 3 pious, apparently Eastern Jews, in socks, bent over their prayer books, their prayer shawls pulled over their heads, making themselves as small as possible. 2 of them are weeping, moved only by the holiday. One of them might only have sore eyes, to which he briefly brings the still folded handkerchief, only to hold his face close to the text again a moment later. The word is not actually or mainly sung, but in the wake of the word, arabesques are drawn from the word, which is spun out as fine as a hair. The little boy, who without the slightest conception of the whole and without any possibility of orientation, the noise in his ears, pushes his way and is pushed through the dense crowd. The apparent clerk who shakes rapidly while praying, which is to be understood only as an attempt to give the strongest possible, even if perhaps uncomprehending, emphasis to every word while sparing the voice, which wouldn't achieve a great clear emphasis in the noise anyhow. The family of the brothel owner. In the Pinchas synagogue, I was seized incomparably more powerfully by Judaism. In the Suha brothel 3 days ago, the one Jewess with a narrow face, or rather that tapers to a narrow chin, but is shaken wide by her hair worn in voluminous waves, the 3 small doors that lead from the inside of the building into the salon, the guests as in a police station on the stage, drinks on the table, scarcely touched, of course, the flat-faced girl in the angular dress that begins to move only far down in a hem. Some of them here and previously dressed like the marionettes for children's theaters that are sold at the Christmas market. That is, with ruffles and gold stuck on and loosely sewn on so that one can tear them off with a single pull, and they then fall apart in one's fingers. The landlady with the dull blonde hair pulled tight over undoubtedly disgusting pads, with the sharply descending nose, the direction of which stands in some geometric relation to the hanging breasts and the stiffly held belly, complains of headaches, which are caused by the fact that today, Saturday, there's such a great commotion and nothing in it. And this is a passage from the same year. Let's see. It's December 1911. My nephew's circumcision this morning. A short man with crooked legs, Austerlitz, who has 2,800 circumcisions behind him, carried the thing out very skillfully. It's an operation made more difficult by the fact that the boy, instead of lying on a table, is lying on his grandfather's lap, and that the surgeon, instead of paying close attention, must murmur prayers. First, the boy is immobilized by wrapping him up, leaving only the member free. Then the area to be cut is precisely defined by putting a perforated metal disc on it. Then, with an almost ordinary knife, a sort of fish knife, the cut is made. Now one sees blood and raw flesh. The mohel busies himself in it briefly with his long-nailed, trembling fingers and pulls skin obtained somewhere like the finger of a glove over the wound. Immediately everything is all right. The baby has hardly cried. Now comes just one more little prayer, during which the mohel drinks wine, and with his not yet completely blood-free fingers brings some wine to the baby's lips. Those present pray. As he has now entered into the covenant, so shall he enter into the knowledge of the Torah, into a happy marriage, and into the performance of good deeds. When I heard the man who accompanied the mohel say the prayer after the meal today, and those present, apart from the two grandfathers, spent the time in dreams or boredom with a complete lack of understanding of the prayer, I saw before me Western European Judaism in a clear, unforeseeable transition about which the first to be affected are not worried, but rather as true transitional people bear what is imposed on them. These religious forms, having arrived at their final end, had, even in their present practice, such an undisputed, merely historical character that only the passage of a very short time within this morning seemed necessary to arouse historical interest among those present by telling them about the outdated former custom of circumcision and its half-sung prayers.
Thank you, Ross. We've now set the stage nicely for the topic of our program, which is Kafka and Judaism. I'll just introduce the two panelists briefly. Ross Benjamin, as I said yesterday, or the day before, I forget. Pardon the repetition for those who have been coming the previous days. Ross Benjamin is one of the leading German to English translators. In 2023, Benjamin published the first complete English translation of Kafka's diaries and the accompanying notes from the German critical edition, which is what Ross was reading from and is now available for the first time in English, as I said. His previous translations are many, so I won't go through all of them, and include works by major contemporary German writers like Daniel Kehlmann and Clement Zetz, and classics like Josef Roth and Friedrich Hodlerlin. He has been the recipient of many awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, a National Endowment for the Arts Translation Grant, and a Fulbright Fellowship. Benjamin is also an essayist, and his work has appeared in the New York Times, the Times Literary Supplement, and many other places. Most recently, Ross published a fantastic essay on works by the German writer Jenny Erpenbeck, the recent winner of the Booker Prize. Again, as before, we're very happy to have Ross at the Jewish Museum for the Transatlantic Kafka program. Daniel Medin, who I also introduced yesterday, is a professor of English and comparative literature at the American University of Paris. He is the author of the book Three Sons, Kafka and the Fiction of J.M. Coetzee, Philip Roth, and W.G. Sebald. The book, as I said yesterday, closely traces the decades-long reading of Kafka, so the enduring engagement with Kafka of these three giants of modern literature, and argues, and this is what I really like about the book, that an important and neglected element of the Kafka studies and Kafka interpretation is the way that Kafka's work generated creative responses, so not just scholarly responses, but creative responses, literary responses. Daniel has been the judge of prestigious literary prizes and also works as an editor and translator, not really, as an editor of translations, and is also an accomplished essayist. So it's my pleasure to have Daniel here for the program at the Jewish Museum. Thank you. So we'll just enter into the discussion now. So thanks. So our topic tonight is, as I said, Kafka and Judaism. And it's a big topic. And the broader kind of conception is not only Kafka and Judaism, but also the concept of belonging, Kafka and belonging. But in order to kind of set the stage for an understanding of Kafka's Judaism, we really need some foundation in Jewish life at the time. So I was going to kind of turn to Daniel maybe and see if you would sketch some of the texture of the Jewish life or religious life in Prague and Central Europe in these years.
I wouldn't want to be too... Hello, is this working? Yes, it is. Yes. Even I can hear. I wouldn't want to be too presumptuous, and thank you, Seth, also for the very kind introduction, and to everyone here on the ground who has helped to organize these conversations and wonderful events, and in fact, international representations of Kafka's work and legacy. It's really an honor to be in Prague, of all places, in a synagogue like this, in a neighborhood that was Kafka's neighborhood, of course, and I'll stop this
Amen.
For ramble to actually address the question. I didn't want to be too presumptuous because we are in Prague, and so while teaching perhaps at a university in the United States, you might have to explain how it was that this important writer from Prague wrote in German and what Austria-Hungary was. I maybe take for granted that many of you are already familiar with that. But perhaps I can encapsulate something that's interesting in terms of Kafka's reception, because I think it wasn't until after the 1980s that this very basic biographical detail, which Ernst Pavel mentions in his, it's kind of, I think, the basis of Ernst Pavel's biography, The Nightmare of Reason, which is, what does it mean to be a Jew born in Prague in 1883? That very basic question, which is to say, and on top of that, you might say, what does it mean to be a German-speaking Jew in Prague, born into, well, I can't say born into the middle class, but his family ultimately achieved a middle class at that time. And it's strange because there was a discrepancy. I think it was possible to ignore that in reception of Kafka's work in the university, but also among different writers after the Second World War, because there's no presence of that Judaism in the fiction. The fiction is non-specific. You have names like Joseph, and which are common in Austria-Hungary, but that's about as specific as it gets. He doesn't give you street names. He doesn't give you specific scenarios that, as it were, point to Judaism, to the golem, to aspects of Prague. It's been, all that kind of specificity has been removed from the fiction. So it's somewhat of a shock when you begin to look at the, say, private documents, diaries, letters, the extent to which Kafka himself is preoccupied with different aspects of Judaism. And I think that only became public gradually. Maybe that by way of a beginning, and for you to respond to or to kick off.
Yeah, well, I remember, because the same way the fiction came out first, is basically what you're saying, and the personal documents came out later, the letters and the diaries, and it was surprising. It was the same way, and to get autobiographical about it, in my reading experience, I read the fiction first, then began reading the letters and diaries, and was myself struck the same way maybe posterity was struck by how constantly he was grappling with Jewish questions, Jewish themes in his letters and diaries, how explicitly he was, and how those themes were explicitly the same themes that are implicit in the fiction, but that you might not have recognized as such, or as recognized as potently as such if you didn't read the autobiographical or the personal writings. And so the same themes of belonging, the themes we're going to talk about today, alienation, shame, objection, exile, tradition, and the lack thereof, those Jewish themes that he talks about as explicitly Jewish themes, and really eloquently articulates his thinking about, and his evolving thinking, his ambivalent thinking, his complex and not always for us decipherable thinking about those same themes he's working through in his fiction. So it seems so obvious once you read it in his personal writings that, and yet he chose to anonymize it in his fiction in such a way that some people at once, once you kind of had the whole corpus, it was still possible to kind of take sides, so that like a John Updike would say, I think I talked about this during our last conversation, and I'm paraphrasing a lot from an article I recently read that I found very illuminating by Judith Shulevitz in The Atlantic about some new Kafka translations, where she talked about his parables and a lot about the subjects we're talking about tonight. And anybody who has access to it, definitely read her article, because she brings up this Updike introduction, which I remember reading in it was the introduction to the collected stories, the complete stories. So it's still the only volume of complete stories. It includes an introduction by Updike, who says that, for all that we might recognize the ethnic origins, I think he uses the ethnic origins of Kafka's themes, he transcends them, and it's not at all, he's praising him for not being sectarian or parochial. And Ozick responded that, that's ridiculous. Every word of Kafka emerges directly from Mitteleuropa's tormented Jewish psyche. And that's it's possible to take both those positions toward his work because it simultaneously is so present and is not explicit, as you said. And characters who have names, like the ethnic names in Kafka are like the Irish names of characters in America, or there's some discussion of so whether it has some kind of, but right. So there's mention, of place. It's not that there's no places, but it really gets stripped away, and then suddenly names turn to initials, and like he's always moving. He delocalizes more and more, anonymizes more and more as his fiction evolves.
Can I do this obnoxious thing of illustrating by anecdote? Because you mentioned Updike, and I usually don't put Updike and Kafka together. But Updike wrote these short stories in which he impersonated these Beck stories, in which the hero is a Jewish author. And there's an earlier one where it's a part of the anecdote. My opinion has nothing to do with it, because you'll see how I echo the anecdote. This involves an American writer is visiting Prague during the Cold War, and he's accompanied to the Jewish cemetery because he wants to see Kafka's grave. And, there's some Czech officer who has to be by his side the entire time. And the Jewish writer says, great Czech writer. And the officer says, no, Jewish. And when I visited Poland for the first time, I was with a friend from grad school, some other people, and I expressed this honest, response, because the question, which was also sympathetic too, why do you want to be in Poland? Why do you want to? And then I said I would love to be able to read Polish. Why do you want to read Polish? And I was like, the great writers. And he's like, so start listing writers. Szymborska and Miłosz and so on. And then I said Bruno Schulz. And this was one of these moments where no irony whatsoever. No, he is a Jewish writer, and that separation between like linguistic national identity, this question of belonging and language in terms of what defines you as a part of that literature. To me, the language is Polish, whatever Bruno Schulz, whatever he puts into the Polish, it's still Polish. Yeah. And I think those kinds of question of belonging and the way that belonging is perceived, and because it's also Kafka who was, I think, up there with, Emily Dickinson in terms of being able to understand the negative of everything, the other side of it. If this is a conversation about Kafka and belonging, I think it's also a conversation about not belonging. And that aspect of Judaism and non-Judaism and the pressure it exerts on his work is extraordinary. And some of that pressure is external.
100%. And just to quote one of the most famous lines of Kafka on the subject of his generation of German-speaking Czech Jews, which is how he describes or he doesn't say Czech, but of German-speaking Jews in Prague, my generation of German-speaking Jews in Prague, he says how their hind legs are still mired in the traditional Judaism of their fathers, while with their forelegs they struggle and fail to find new ground. And then he says, from this I must take my inspiration, which is an important follow-up.
The desperation of that dilemma was it became the inspiration.
Sorry, can I just cut in for 1 second? Can you kind of sketch a little bit, like what he felt alienated from? Like what were some of the forms or institutions or cultural contexts that were generating this strong response by Kafka?
You know, his parents both grew up with probably rather traditional or fully traditional Jewish upbringings, if I'm not mistaken, in rural Bohemia, right? But different class, different social strata. But they didn't, because they were socially mobile, particularly, you know, with his father and his business, and they were joining the middle class, they didn't raise his generation of Jews as observant in that fashion. They were sort of half-hearted about it, and, you know, had tendencies that at the time would have been called assimilationist, you know. And I think Kafka and Brod and people in their circle, many of them felt that their parents kind of had stranded them from the source of the tradition, the traditional sources. And Kafka, you know, in his letter to his father, which I also discussed in our last conversation, he is he's reproaching his father, but he says, I'm not reproaching you, it's just that you reproached me for insufficient Judaism, but it always bothered me when you did, because you were the person at the back of the temple just like talking about business, and we only went 4 times a year, and my bar mitzvah was just a matter of learning by rote. And it's often noted that his bar mitzvah was announced in the Prague newspaper as a confirmation. That was the typically assimilationist move, was to just use this sort of analogous Christian terms. I remember translating Yosef wrote, and at the Passover Seder in Job, in Yosef wrote's Job, he calls the matzah the Easter bread. That's how far they went with that kind of language. And this is like a deeply, explicitly Jewish novel. Do you want to pick up from there so I don't just keep talking?
And then there's the elements that Kafka articulates in the letter to his father, where he talks about the kind of Judaism that, you know, which would be viewed as organic, you know, bottom up, you know, it's a sort of that the father's unable to transmit it. That when he goes to synagogue, the father himself doesn't know the prayers, but they have to go to synagogue, and they're supposed to go to synagogue, and they're supposed to marry Jews, and they're supposed to be bar mitzvahed, and they're supposed to belong to this thing.
It's empty forms.
That is empty. Yeah, exactly, empty forms.
A tradition drained of meaning. So the 2 passages I read, they each include observations of contemporary Jews who don't understand what they're doing or saying. There's the person at the temple saying the prayers and trying to give them a special emphasis by shaking, and he means the davening, you know, but possibly because he doesn't even comprehend what he's saying. And then there's the people discussing the circumcision other than the grandparents, right? But the rest of them are either not paying attention, or they're discussing it as if it's a historical peculiarity, even though they were just there performing one earlier that morning. And so that sense of being detached from tradition. Go ahead.
And I think he found something that was more authentic in, for example, the appearance of actors from a Yiddish theater group that had come from Lemberg at the time. There were aspects of what was considered Eastern Judaism or Eastern European Judaism, both cultural in terms of literature, but high and low. He wasn't just looking, he was reading, you might say high, but it was also just interested in daily aspect. And by the way, because it's Kafka, it's of course full of ambivalence, because over the course of the First World War, you get all of these refugees who stream into the cities like Prague. And I think it was Alice Herz-Sommer was very young at the time and recollected that Kafka, faced by some of these immigrants on the other side of the street, said something along the lines like, I belong to them, you know, and which reminds me of the kind of the 2 sides to this question of belonging, one of which is self-identified, like my Judaism. The other is the way people view you from without, which is to say that, you're not, for a Czech nationalist, if you're speaking German, you're a kind of enemy. And then the Jews are kind of conveniently the enemy of both sides,
Right. It would be like throughout, as many people here know better than I do, their Czech history, but throughout Czech history, it would be the case that, the Czech ire toward the oppressive Habsburg monarchy could be vented on the German-speaking Jews as stand-ins for Germans, because they're the Germans. And even in the letters to Melina, which will be discussed soon in a lecture by Merve Emre, he talks about, actually, no, I forget this passage, but she's describing all the Germans she knows, or he's talking about somebody who's describing all her German acquaintances, but it's an anecdote from Heinrich Heine, all the Germans, and the Germans are all this way, and she's describing them the way maybe someone with some anti-Semitic prejudices would be describing Jews, and he's saying, no, that person's a Jew, that's a Jew, and you're calling them the Germans. So there's this conflation that also, of course, complicates your sense of belonging. And that's one of the major misreadings of these diary entries about small literatures that are inspired by his encounter with the Yiddish theater. And he became deeply enamored with this theater and this visiting theater troupe from Lemberg, he befriended this actor Yitzhak Löwy, from whom he learned all these stories of Jewish life in Warsaw, where Levi had grown up, and he learned about yeshiva, and he's taking notes in his diaries, yeshivas are Talmudic colleges, like he's learning about all of this from Levi, and he has crushes on the actresses. There's infatuation with Madame Chisik, which led I.B. Singer to write a really funny story called The Friend of Kafka. What did he see in this Yitzhak Löwy? How could that have been Kafka's friend? And these shabby actors around Warsaw, which is precisely what Kafka liked about them. And it goes back to maybe some of the dynamics that Elif Bataman last night was talking about with Max Brod, where the very thing that people now can't understand was what the appeal was for Kafka. And of course his father, who anything about Kafka and Belonging in Judaism is very overshadowed by his domineering father. When Kafka finally found, and he says this as sort of the next move in the letter to his father, which is a rhetorical, juggernaut attack on his father. He says, when I finally found a way to really embrace Judaism and go into it deeply with the Yiddish theater, then you were disdainful and contemptuous of these Eastern European Jews who didn't speak German but Yiddish and came from, an impoverished shtetl milieu that was looked down on as backward. And
it was the line, "He who goes to bed with dogs wakes up with fleas." That was his comment, I think, on the friendship with Löwy.
He mentions it in the diaries. For some reason it's mangled. It says, and it's interestingly mangled because he says, he who lies in bed with dogs, and beds are always so important in Kafka. Gregor Samsa wakes up in his bed. For some reason he specifies that he's in his bed, which always bothers translators because they don't know where to put the "in his bed." And why do we have to even say he's in his bed? But beds in Kafka are huge. I'm sure people have written dissertations about beds in Kafka, but there's no bed in the usual saying. And then he says they wake up with bugs, with Wanzen, which are basically bed bugs, but it's also what Kafka always called the transformation or the metamorphosis. He called it my bug story, my Wanzen-Geschichte, and every day, talking to his friends. So they wake up with bugs. And Kafka obviously was so sensitive to these kinds of comparisons of Jews with insects and animals that were part of the anti-Semitic vocabulary that his father is echoing as an assimilated, superior-feeling, German-speaking Western Jew vis-a-vis his Eastern European counterparts, friend of his son. And one of the things I find interesting, about when I was translating the diaries and about certain things that Max Brod censored in the previous edition of the diaries, was that Kafka then identified some of these prejudices in himself. He implicated himself in it. And that's one of the things that Brod actually deleted, which was where Kafka goes to the theater with his friend Löwy. And there's this one line where it says, "Löwy told me of his gonorrhea," That was cut. And then I leaned over and our heads touched and I became afraid due to at least the possibility of lice about the hygiene of his Eastern European Jewish counterpart, and again with the insects. And these tropes, of course, are in his work and are, again, implicitly tropes drawn from anti-Semitic. Yeah,
thanks. That was super interesting. You were talking nicely about the Yiddish theater and those dynamics, and of course that's like a substantial part of the first part of the diaries, and really interesting. And eventually, as with most of these things, Kafka's interest in the Yiddish theater starts to wane for various reasons, which I'm sure you could go on at length about. But I'm interested in this pattern of that. Okay, he's raised in this sort of assimilationist, sort of what he perceives as superficial religious culture. But then he's presented in the Yiddish theater as probably the most substantial manifestation. He's presented with kind of alternative models, one after another. And what's so fascinating to me is that some of them have an allure, and even with the Yiddish theater, he's embracing it quite fully for a while. One moment which always puzzled me, and I would love to hear you talk about, is the issue of the Martin Buber addresses in Prague. So the Jewish theologian Martin Buber comes to Prague in, I think, 1909 or 1904 or 6. I forget the precise year, but he gives these 3 lectures on Judaism, and he kind of blows apart all kind of orthodox tenets of the faith. And he's so kind of charismatic, and his critique is so deep that he attracts like an immediate following, and especially among Kafka's closest friends. And Kafka is going to these lectures, or he's aware of the lectures, and in the diaries there are some reflections on the lectures, but he never goes down the sort of Buber path as almost all of his generation went down, at least for some time. So again, he's presented with a viable model, at least as demonstrated by his acquaintances in France, but he doesn't take it. He doesn't take the path, right? And what does it say about his relationship to faith that or just in general, and you can take it any way you want, but how would you kind of think about the way that he responds to this paradigm or this alternative of Judaism?
I mean, I think in the case of Buber, what he presents is a possibility of, the broader phenomenon is that of cultural authenticity. And if Jews are striving to assimilate and be accepted as just Germans or just as Czechs, the message in Buber is you don't need to do this. There exists within you. And I think about the beginnings of nationalism in the early 19th century and the German response to this and the occupation by Napoleon's army and things like that is like, oh, we have these texts like the Nibelungenlied. There's this treasure of authentically German national experience. We've been trying to import these other things and imitate their models when we have our own historical, there's the possibilities to mine and to enrich ourselves from, because that belongs to us. So I think Buber, in telling these stories, many of which are literary, is presenting that kind of opportunity. And I think Kafka was responsive to that. He was just not responsive to the political enactment. I think part of his fascination with Jewish culture and with whether in its many aspects. It's interesting to distinguish between high and low, because I have to say that, and you can even see Kafka objectively finding the quality of some of these Yiddish plays. I mean, it's basically a restaurant around the corner from here, and, a bunch of actors playing multiple roles, sometimes fighting with each other, and then a curtain that's hanging up in the corner of the restaurant. It's so, we're not talking this kind of, exactly. So he's doing that.
Costumes are falling apart, yeah.
And reading, but even in the Kabbalah, when he began to learn more about Kabbalah, it was often through people, direct. Some through reading, but then he had this friend, Georgi Langer, was the guy who grew up, I think, in a middle-class Czech family and ended up going off to the east and
following a
becoming an assimilated Hasid, in that direction. So it seems like Kafka was interested in the human, and certainly did some of this mining himself, but for different purposes, which to my mind had more to do with literary exploration and the stories themselves, which interest him. You mentioned the circumcision entry. I think it's perhaps the same one, or it's a little bit later, where he talks about a story about circumcision that he had heard. I think it's from Löwy, in which the mohel is sucking at the blood of the child. I mean, they're interesting stories and interesting anecdotes, and I think that had an appeal to Kafka, those kinds of stories.
Yeah, and the shabbiness and the mediocrity of the theater is echoed, like in his description of his transcription of Löwy's description of the mikveh, like as this filthy facility, and he's interested in like the earthy, and that's a literary interest, an artistic interest. And from the Yiddish theater, there are characters he describes in the plays who are clearly the models for characters in his later fiction. Almost certainly the models for the assistants in the castle come from these two characters and kaftans that he describes in the very first Yiddish play, Der Messerschmidt, that he watches in the Café Savoy after Frau Klug impersonates a man, and he describes the way these characters function in the plot, and it's exactly the way the assistants function in the castle. And then, even his relationship with community and belonging, which really, when you describe that pattern, it makes me think, first of all, back to Elif's lecture again, where she said how Brod anticipated so many of the later frameworks that we use, and we owe it to him in a certain sense for setting those terms. And she quoted him saying how Kafka had these two opposing impulses that couldn't be resolved, and one was the longing for solitude, and the other was the will to sociability. And you could basically map that onto what we're talking about, the longing for community or for some kind of holistic belonging in some kind of revived Jewish community. Or you also read that passage from Josephine Mausinger about how the artist actually gives them a kind of communal cohesion with her piping, and that's something many people suspect he's talking about his experience of the Yiddish theater there, or he's channeling it, at least, whether or not even consciously channeling, or it just mirrors the way he felt about the Yiddish theater, how they became. And he has this line, actually, in the first passage about the Yiddish theater that's pretty amazing, actually, and became the whole point of that book by Martha Robart that was called As Lonely as Franz Kafka, Sul Kom Kafka. There's this line where he's writing about one of the actresses dancing, and he says her dance is somewhat reminiscent of the Schlapak. Some songs, the pronunciation Jüdische Kinderloch, some glimpses of this woman who on the stage, because she's a Jew, draws us listeners to her because we're Jews, without longing for or curiosity about Christians, sent a tremor over my cheeks. And Martha Robart claims that's when Kafka says we, and it's a very rare moment. And then scholar Vivian Lifka has kind of blown that apart in her book called When Kafka Says We, and really shows in his work how ever-present actually the longing for community is, along with that tension with the inability to belong, or the alienation, the pariahdom, and down to the castle. Yeah.
I'm really glad that you mentioned this story. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, a very late story of Kafka's Josephine the Singer, because it's about a mouse who sings, but doesn't really sing, actually. It's just kind of making this whistling noise. And on the one hand, her presence in the community creates a sense of community. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, the thing that's built into that story is the fact that it's an illusion. That because the singing probably doesn't exist at all. It's a symbol. And I think you have all the ambivalence of Kafka's sense of belonging and religious identity, including the ambivalence toward Zionism, which is coupled with being interested in Zionism, the ambivalence toward all of these different aspects of it. I mean, for him, it's not a solution to the larger problem. It's just an extension of self and the thing that he's curious about and where he's coming from.
Kafka's never about resolution, right? I mean, that's the thing. He's always about sharpening the contradictions and deepening the questions.
Also, I think illuminating profound illusions that we have that are very deeply set and that are basic, that are somehow part of our wiring. I hate to use "our" in that case, but I mean, like, he's very good at getting at impulses that are beneath the consciousness in terms of what is needed. I think what he expresses in that short story is the absolute need for community, even when it's founded on an illusion. You know, it's that seems so present.
Yeah, but then a complete attunement to the internal contradictions in that. Well, to take it away from all this Judaism stuff and broaden out to the sense of belonging, I think you see the exact same pattern in this, like, really comical early diary entry where he's attending lectures by Rudolf Steiner about theosophy, which is yet a whole other system and metaphysics, and he reports all these stories about Steiner and about theosophy and its systems and its principles, and he reports them so dryly that you can't tell if it's just a clinical report or a completely ironic one. And then he has an audience with Steiner in between a couple of the lectures which he attended. He calls it, my audience with Dr. Steiner. And he goes in and he visits him in his office, and he has this prepared speech that he wants to present to him. And when you read the speech, it sounds really earnest, like that he deeply wants to embrace theosophy. He says, like, a large part of my being is striving toward theosophy. And I think in my literary writing, I've maybe reached states that are similar to the clairvoyant states you describe, Herr Doctor, and yet, but how could I do it? Because
I've got my job, I've got my writing, and now I have to have theosophy on top of it.
Yeah, I can't add a third thing to the job and the writing. Those two things already are tearing me in two. And so I don't see, but if you said I could do it, I think I could do it, Herr Doctor. And you're thinking, like, why is he so attracted to this possibility? He seems so earnest about it. And then the last paragraph of this diary entry says, describes what Steiner's doing the whole time he's giving this speech. He says, he's nodding and trying to, maybe he sees that as an aid to concentration. And then he has a quiet head cold is bothering him, and he keeps sticking a handkerchief up his nose in one nostril and digging around in his nostril with it. And it just ends there. And he's completely undercut everything. And that sort of encapsulates what you're describing, where and it happens when he goes to the Zionist Congress too. He's in Vienna for an accident prevention conference for his office, for a business trip. And then at the same time, there's one of the World Zionist Congresses is happening there. It's a historic thing. And he attends some lectures. But then all the things he describes are like, about the way that people are squabbling and a certain type of face, that head shape that some of them have, and so on. Like, he can't stop observing so minutely what's somehow comical or distancing, at the same time as he's seeking some kind of connection. He's also always disconnecting, stepping back, and then feeding the literary impulse. Like, it all gets fed back into his writing, and that ends up sort of preempting, I think, every one of these possibilities.
But I love the way he deflates, almost comically, certain strivings for transcendence. There's an anecdote about how he was invited for a while. It was, almost like the Ouija board when I was a teenager. People get together and they all sit around the table, and they're supposed to put their hands on the table and things like this. And Kafka had to go to one of these things with Franz Werfel. And I think what he said was something along the lines of that the sun rises every day. Every morning, that's a miracle. That a table moves when you maltreat it, is not a miracle, you know. But that skepticism, which he carried into everything, including, of course, his own self-observations and his own family members. And I mean, you look at that distanced perspective, which I think he trained, maybe that's in the temperament, but he trained the writing of that perspective through the diaries. I think that's evident even reading in your translation, going through it chronologically. You can see how he gets good at the things that are close to him, but also the things that are distant. These physical descriptions of people in the street or friends that he knows. I mean, this kind of and it's at an angle. It's not somehow from some cosmic, objective distance thing, but somehow he manages to diminish his own subjectivity, even while the perspective that he describes, the gesticulations, the movements are almost unforgettable.
Yeah, it's this one entry where he's like, all these travelers to Palestine, they come back and they do this with their finger, like he's describing they're zealous about Palestine, but he's describing their gestures like they all tap the table in a certain way while they're talking, or I don't remember the exact gestures, you know, but he's acting as if they all have these really minute kind of giveaways or like a tell or something in the way they express their zealousness, and you can't stop seeing those. And I think he uses that in his work, if I recall, and I haven't read the trial very recently, but isn't there a scene where like Joseph K. is trying to he's doing something really important with he's taking Tintorelli. I think Veronica spoke about it, where he's giving him a tour of the cathedral. Is his name Tintorelli, the Italian? Yeah, the Italian painter, but he keeps getting distracted by his mustache or something like that. And it's like Kafka always kind of let himself get distracted by these details in a way that was very generative for his art. Yeah.
And then, but I feel like this is getting off the track of the Judaism. But I mean, this is one of the things I enjoy most about Kafka's writing is the attentiveness and these weird details, which in the fictions, I mean, even just the description of the uniform of the people who arrest Joseph K. I think probably the first time, second time, third time that I read the trial, I don't know that I even noticed this really odd description of the specifics of the shirt. And eventually, this is the great thing about rereading Kafka, and perhaps why it's so exciting, and that the work doesn't tire, and it needs different translations from time to time to refresh, the language in whatever target language is there's always the degree of observation, I mean, whether it's in the diary of people out in the rest of the world or whether it's of the fictional characters, is often so surprising and so particular that that literary experience itself feels valuable and vitalizing, and it's exciting to actually read it. There's a kind of weirdness, or even because I know that I think there's an exhibition now that's not an exhibition, a game of some sort, a city walk titled after Odradek, the character of that story.
I love how we can't figure out what the thing is, and you also can't figure out what Odradek is, but we can't figure out what this exhibition
both
is
both linguistic
either.
and then in terms of the shape of the object itself. Yeah.
I just, in the kind of final part, I want to sort of invert it a little bit and talk about a bit like who Kafka belongs to. You know, we talked a lot about Kafka feeling a sense of belonging or alienation in various ways, or a complex mix of those two impulses. Daniel, you've done a lot of work on, for example, Philip Roth's embrace or engagement with Kafka. And we had Veronica Takrova earlier in the week talk really eloquently about what Kafka meant to the Czechoslovak culture in the post-war, and especially to a kind of dissident culture. So can you talk a little bit about, can you kind of like put the other, or sort of the transatlantic bookend, and talk a little bit about what you think was so important about Kafka for post-war American Jewish writers? I mean, you can choose whatever angle you want, whether for Roth or for that generation. Because they really embraced Kafka as sort of belonging to them, right? And they kind of formed a literary culture in a way around people, Kafka and others, but Kafka was certainly central in that literary identity of American Jewish post-war fiction. So maybe address that a little bit?
I can begin to. I think, as I said yesterday, what's interesting about Kafka's work, but possibly this is true of many authors, is that in one's response, in a strong response to a work of art or an author, there's autobiography behind it. So I use sometimes something autobiographical that the author, him or herself, doesn't even know. To be attracted by a certain writer means something, but what that actually means, it's a wide range of things. So as I said, like Kundera's particular grievance with Max Brod for publishing private materials against the express will of Kafka says something about what Kundera felt about his own fiction and the distinction between, and the control that an author should have over his or her work, right? And I think, sure, you could say all sorts of things. What did Kafka look like in the United States to many authors after the war? I think in the case of Philip Roth, I mean, it depends on the information that was available to them. Yeah,
I'll just cut it. Roth has this kind of stunning piece where he imagines Kafka as an uncle of his, right, who's survived the war.
Well, he imagines him as his Hebrew school teacher.
Yeah, school teacher who's dating his aunt. Yeah, so is a Hebrew school teacher who's dating his aunt, who's sitting at a family dinner table.
Yeah.
So can you, what was the impulse there, do you think?
In some ways, I don't want to revisit that. And I can't speak for Philip Roth's impulses, and I'm actually glad that I can't account for them. I think, Philip Roth saw in Kafka like a great writer, and, but like so many other authors reading other authors, you pick out the things that you need. So you could say, yes, like Kafka, I went to a school that was mostly composed of, lower middle class Jews, that was the kind of environment that I was raised in. But I mean, he's very selective, and you have misreadings of certain aspects of Kafka's life and his work but I guess the point is that they're generative to the author. That's the important thing, is less important like how representative is this of Kafka's own fiction, but rather, okay, so Philip Roth is interested in a later form of assimilation of Jews in the United States, in his generation, things that he's familiar with. Later on, as a result of this interest, he begins to travel to Prague in the 70s. He's, admirably is passing on money to dissident writers. He's actually, as it were, putting his money where his mouth is. And he begins to explore that aspect of Kafka's biography. He has a gigantic poster of Kafka in his writing cabin, whatever. But I think each writer is different. I think the difference is sure, absolutely, Philip Roth saw Kafka as a Jewish writer. And that was an essential aspect. What does it mean to be a writer and a Jew? And I think that's an element and of course, Roth read other people who were not Jewish, but Kafka somehow embodied something of that combination that must have been important to him.
Even going all the way back to the 30s or late 20s, 30s, we find writers, intellectuals, philosophers, mainly Jewish, and they want to claim Kafka for their own kind of philosophical or religious agenda. There's a debate, for example, between Gershom Scholem and Schoeps about what does Kafka's work mean in relation to Judaism. This is already in the mid-30s or early 30s. Max Brod in his biography, which I think is also in the mid to late 30s, is claiming Kafka as a Jewish writer of a certain sort. It's not. It's quite fascinating because you don't see many writers who other intellectuals, thinkers. Walter Benjamin's trying to claim Kafka in a sense as a Jewish thinker,
and then you have
and all of them are sort of they're debating what kind of Jewish writer. What kind of writer Jewish Kafka is. So
this is Kafka-esque with the microphones
Ross,
turning on.
Can you maybe pick that up and just
I mean, first of all, to zoom way out, which again Elif addressed yesterday with the contentious trial between the National Library of Jerusalem, claiming Kafka. How do you claim Kafka for a state that didn't exist in his lifetime? And then the Germans claiming Kafka, who were responsible, who murdered his family and friends, and would have murdered the ones who survived too if they could have. How are they claiming Kafka? And this becomes this sort of really wide-angle subject of who does Kafka belong to. But just to bring it way back down to the really individual and biographical, I haven't met many lovers of Kafka who aren't intensely proprietarial about him in my everyday encounters. Like everybody thinks their Kafka is Kafka, and that's not the case with every writer that people love. They don't always then want to claim him. But like even some of the responses to my translation of the diaries that were a little more, had a little more friction and controversy about them, they often began with like, this is what it was like when I first read the old edition of the diaries, and this is the bookstore I went to in my neighborhood that's not the same as it used to be, and this was the jacket I was wearing then. Like these very personal stories that somehow people are proprietary about Kafka. So I guess I'm not actually answering the question, but just that's kind of a mystery in a way, what it is about him that makes.
I think when Kafka's Metamorphosis was published at one point, one of the early reviews could be summed up along the lines of like, this is so German. And then Max Brod writes a review, and Max Brod is saying, this is so Jewish. And Kafka writes a letter, I think it's to Felice or something, and it's like, because these two things cannot be fused somehow. I think that's present in Kafka, and maybe that's also something that part of the reason that he feels important to many readers, because he articulates what this sense of not belonging fully to any single thing. And I leave it as broadly as possible there. In his case, we're talking about linguistic, ethno-linguistic, religious communities. But, and he jokes, he uses a circus metaphor. He's like, what am I, a circus rider on two horses, right? Because it can't be the same horse at that point.
Yeah, and I think that you're just reminding me of like, how can you be a Jewish writer and a post-theological writer at the same time? And I'm coming back to this article that I liked so much by Judith Shulevitz, where she said, Kafka's writing is Jewish the way the Old Testament is Jewish. And she says that is, he's also Christian, and he's also speaking of the human condition, and the biblical aspect of his writing is very much there. He's writing parables that are as baffling as, in fact, biblical parables are. Like there are these writers like Adorno and Benjamin who say that he's basically like writing a new doctrine or a new tradition, but has lost the key to the tradition. But I don't think the tradition in the first place had a key, and I think Kafka's picking up on that like when you really look at the Gospel of Luke or something and the parables in there, it's utterly puzzling. And he has that parable about parables where he says, what's the point of parables if the whole point of them is to say that the incomprehensible is incomprehensible? But that's like, what's the point of Kafka if his whole thing is to say the incomprehensible is incomprehensible?
And I want to go back to the title of this talk because it's connected to something that that Kafka writes, I think, in the diaries, right? It's like, what do I have in common with the Jews? I barely have anything in common with myself.
No definite article, though, in my translation. What do I have in common with Jews? It's interesting. I think it's important.
Localized.
What do I have in common with Jews?
Yeah. And I think that impulse, while there have been many Jews to express it beautifully, and I think Groucho Marx is the other one, which is, I don't want to belong to any club who would have someone like me as a member. And I don't think that Jews own that perspective or that desire to be limited in terms of belonging and identity.
I mean,
in
that's so much
way.
Kafka's modernity, I don't have anything in common with myself. That's now the modern fractured individual. Like, it's not the individual who doesn't belong to a community. It's that you're internally divided, and and he mines that for, endless. I mean, what's so interesting about him circling these same problems and never resolving them and always kind of escalating them is that he doesn't ever seem repetitious, not even in the diary. I mean, and in the diary, sometimes he's literally repetitious. He's saying, I wrote nothing today, you know, or my stomach, my insomnia, etc. And yet he doesn't sound like a broken record, because then suddenly he turns it all into an animal story, or he turns the same problem into a parable or into an aphorism or into, you know, an unfinished novel that is utterly compelling and, as you said, invigorating and, you know. Are we going over? 5:05? Oh, 6:05.
So, yeah, well, one more question and then we'll end it.
I want to divert just because I have this opportunity, because Ross is here, and this doesn't have so much to do with Judaism, but one particular aspect of the diaries as this kind of writer's workspace, bless you, is that, you know, it's got everything is thrown into it. From self-observations to travel notes to responses to works of art. And one of the interesting things for you as a translator is you actually get to translate fiction by Kafka in its first draft, because those things are dropped in there. It's also a writing space where, you know, there are stillborn stories. If they were stories, it's even hard to tell. These are just you just imagine him in the middle of the night writing and seeing where that carries him. So I wanted to ask you how it felt to, you know, I think you have the Judgment in its entirety. You have some of the work that he did on the Stoker, the first chapter.
The Stoker in its entirety, yeah.
Yeah, The Man Who Disappeared. Did you distinguish some of these works, which you must have read in translation? You're familiar with the final version in the original. I would be interested in hearing what it feels like to, because I think that's one of the strange things about a diary. Often if we think of a diary, we imagine something that is full of observations, daily observations, you know, and this is much more all over. It's a diary, but the diary is basically his notebooks, which also is the space in which he generates his creative work.
Yeah, and like you said, lots of work that doesn't pan out, but that seems so promising, you know, where he has like 100 pages of drafts and redrafts of the same material with some big chunks that seem to be really getting into a flow, but then the flow breaks off and, you know, he starts again from the beginning and goes off in a totally different direction, but then breaks it off and, you know, and then the Judgment, then fully realized works. Like the Judgment in the diaries is word for word almost the piece that he published, with a couple small variants that are intriguing for scholars, but really don't matter that much. I mean, one is the thing where he takes up the place, like he says, an Armenian priest, and in the final edition, it's just a priest, you know. But what's really different, of course, is that on the page, he starts dropping punctuation and paragraph breaks and line breaks as he sort of is swept up in the inspiration and writing it, and that's where you sense this really immediate kind of physical process of writing that goes hand in hand with so much physicality in the diaries, you know, that was, again, this was all tidied up by Brod, or the Judgment was left out and given a footnote, and the sex stuff was taken out, the carnality. But the carnality of the sex is kind of equivalent to or similar to that, the physicality of the punctuation, where he's just getting into a kind of spoken rhythm, the vocal, the body. And so that embodiedness was something I really felt as a translator, and also tried to preserve by keeping those unorthodoxies of punctuation and idiosyncrasies and quirks and so on. I want to get back to what the key question was. What was the core of your question?
It had to do with being confronted with...
with the literary works.
The literary works.
Yeah. Well, so that it became something also in the talk yesterday that Aleph mentioned of the provisionality of the literary work became so stark to me because it became clear to me the diaries are provisional. You know, the things he writes that he completely abandons are in there. And yet, as you mentioned, like there was a sort of so-called final product of the Judgment that he published. And yet, in translating the diaries, you sense that these things were kind of plucked out of a flow and just detached from this like wider outpouring of creative energy. and that he himself went back and tried to undo things. In the diaries, he says how he wishes he could have his manuscripts back from the Betrachtung, from contemplation, and lock them up again and not publish them. And then he writes a whole series of alternate endings to In the Penal Colony after he's already published it with the ending that we know. He says the ending of the metamorphosis or transformation is imperfect because of his business trip. And then there are these pieces that were published in Betrachtung that in their diary version differ in various ways. And I, for a Festschrift for the late translator Burton Pike, included the final versions of those pieces by taking the rough draft version I translated and reenacting the changes. So I kept everything that was the same and changed the things that were different. So it was kind of like watching in time lapse as the rough draft turned into the final product, which just really brought home that provisionality of that the final product is where you draw this arbitrary line. And it's, was it Valerie, no work of art is ever finished, it's only abandoned. And even poignantly for Kafka, he says it's either abandoned to posterity or to the flames. It's unclear which, in Kafka and his ambivalence really did. But in a sense, I had that. And because it took me 8 years, I had to accept the provisionality of my translation at a certain point as well, as everyone does when they hand in a draft of a work. And Kafka had so much reluctance and ambivalence about that moment of letting go of it and saying, okay, it's done now, that, I think that was sort of if there's a lesson or something, was about the provisionality of all creative work. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a really eloquent response. And I think with that, we'll take our break and reconvene at 7 for Merve Emre's keynote lecture. So thanks, everyone. Stick around. Have some drinks and food.